All right, let's jump right in. We're really diving deep into this report on economic and social policy in New Zealand.
Lots to unpack.
Yeah, it really makes you think. Actually, right off the bat, there's this quote that kind of knocked me out. Ready for it? Social policy can't be separated from the economic good or bad it brings. Economic policy can't be separated from the social good or bad it brings. Whew,
It's a mouthful, isn't it? Gets your attention.
totally. Like,
Uh,
are we even looking at this the right way?
I think that's what the report's getting at. We often treat economic and social policy as if they're totally separate things, but in reality,
Yeah.
completely
It's
intertwined.
like we've got these blinders on.
Exactly. And because of that, we miss stuff. The report calls it, get this, policy invisibility.
Okay, spooky. Tell me more.
Basically, we focus so much on certain numbers like GDP that we overlook the social costs. It's like, think about a factory opening up. Great for jobs, right? But what if it pollutes a local river or drives up housing costs, forcing people out?
So it's like the good news is loud, but the bad news is hiding.
And sometimes those social costs are bigger than the economic benefits, but we don't see it because of how we're measuring success.
So are we measuring the wrong things?
Mm.
Or just not looking at the whole picture?
Probably a bit of both. And this connects to another big idea in the report, how we define well-being. They're challenging that traditional economic model, the one where...
Where everyone's perfectly rational and only cares about making money.
Exactly. In reality, we're way more complicated. Our decisions are influenced by all sorts of things.
You think?
Culture, our families, what we believe in. Ignoring those factors in policy, it's like trying to explain the entire universe just using physics.
You'd be missing a few galaxies, that's for sure.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key point the report stresses: distribution.
Distribution. You mean how resources are spread out?
Right. And they're not just saying unequal distribution is unfair, though obviously it is. They're arguing it actually holds the economy back.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. If a big chunk of the population can't get a good education or afford health care, they can't contribute as much, right?
Less skilled workforce, less spending power.
And that, my friend, translates into lower economic growth for everyone. They actually cite studies showing that just a 1% increase in income inequality can drag down annual GDP growth by 0.05%. It's significant.
So trickle-down economics isn't the answer.
That's not what the report's saying. It's more like the bigger the gap between the haves and the have-nots, the harder it is for the whole economy to thrive.
Makes you rethink a few things, huh?
It certainly does. And speaking of things that make you rethink, the report also digs into this whole idea of time.
Time. You mean how policies play out over the long term?
Yes, they argue that policymakers often get caught up in the short term, like what'll win the next election, instead of thinking about the long-term consequences of their decisions.
Short-sightedness in action. I bet they have a fancy term for it.
As a matter of fact, they do. Hysteresis.
Hysteresis. Sounds serious.
It is. Essentially, it's the idea that a temporary economic shock can have lasting negative effects even after the initial shock is over. Like imagine a factory closing down during a recession.
Jobs lost. Families struggling.
Right. Now, even if the economy recovers later on, that factory might never reopen. The workers might have moved on, the machinery sold, the whole industry restructured. That's hysteresis.
So even if it seems like things are bouncing back, there can be this underlying damage.
Precisely. And the report argues that this is often overlooked when policies are focused on the here and now. Actually, there's this line I wanted to share. It sums it up perfectly. They say, in our view, the value placed on money and resources by private markets yields too narrow and limited a horizon for social policy considerations.
Wow. So it's not enough to just focus on profits and losses. Got to think about the big picture, the long game.
Exactly. And part of that big picture, it's not just about when, but where. The report highlights how location, geography plays a huge role in how policies actually land.
So it's not just what we do, but where we do it that matters. Starting to sense a theme here.
Right. Even a well-intentioned policy, if it's applied nationally without considering regional differences, can actually backfire.
Backfire how? Give me an example.
Okay, imagine the government's trying to tackle inflation. So they implement some policies, and let's say it works, inflation goes down. But one side effect is that the exchange rate goes up.
Which makes exports more expensive.
Right. And suddenly, industries that rely on selling their goods overseas,
They're hurting.
big time. And often, those industries are concentrated in specific regions. So you've got this national policy that's supposed to be good for the whole country, but it ends up disproportionately harming certain areas.
Creating winners and losers.
Exactly. And the report uses these terms, growth poles. And
Yeah, backwash regions, I think I remember those. It's like the places that benefit versus the places that get left behind, right?
you've got it. Think about a place like Silicon Valley. That's a growth pull. It sucks up investment, talent, resources.
Leaving other places high and dry.
It's a pattern we see again and again. And it highlights why a one-size-fits-all approach to policy just doesn't cut it.
We need to be thinking about those regional differences, the specific impacts.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a case study that really digs into this, disinflation in New Zealand.
Okay, this is interesting to me. New Zealand managed to get inflation really low, but they're also heavily reliant on agriculture.
Yeah.
And agriculture, as we know, can be very vulnerable to these kinds of economic shifts.
It's a great example because it highlights the trade-offs. The report acknowledges that, yeah, New Zealand's disinflation policies back in the 80s, they worked, inflation came down, but
There was a cost.
there were social costs, especially for the agricultural sector.
Like what?
Well, for starters, they got hit by the removal of subsidies right when the exchange rate was making their exports less competitive. Double whammy.
Ouch. So what happened?
Farms going under, people losing their jobs, rural communities struggling. And this is where that idea of hysteresis comes back in.
The long-term damage.
Yeah.
How does that play out on a farm, though?
Imagine a farmer who has to sell their land because they can't make ends meet anymore. Even if the economy recovers later, that land is gone. It's not like you can just snap your fingers and bring back all those years of experience, the family history, the potential for the future.
It's heartbreaking. And it reminds you that these policy decisions, they have a ripple effect. We can't just look at the immediate numbers. We have to think about the human impact.
Exactly. And speaking of human impact, another big policy shift the report looks at is structural reform.
Which is basically about removing barriers to make the economy more efficient, right? Less government intervention, more free market.
In a nutshell. And New Zealand went through a major wave of this back in the 80s. And again, while there were definitely some positive outcomes, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows.
Who felt the downsides?
Well, the report talks about significant job losses, particularly in state sectors that got restructured or privatized. And often, these jobs were concentrated in specific regions, so you had certain communities bearing the brunt of these changes.
Adding insult to injury, especially if those regions were already struggling from, say, the agricultural downturn.
It's a recipe for inequality, and this is a key point the report makes. Markets aren't some neutral force. They're shaped by the choices we make, the policies we implement, and those choices have real consequences for people's lives.
We can't just think about the economy in the abstract. We have to remember that there are human beings behind those numbers, experiencing those ups and downs firsthand.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of human experiences, this ties directly into another case study highlighted in the report, equal pay. It's a perfect example of how economic and social policy are inseparable.
Equal pay, or should I say the lack thereof, is a topic that deserves all the attention it can get. What's the report's take on it?
Well, it starts by acknowledging the obvious, that despite all the laws and progress we've made, the wage gap between men and women is still a thing.
No way. You're telling me that laws aren't enough to fix this?
If only it were that simple. The report argues that there are deeper social and cultural factors at play here that legislation alone can't address.
Like what?
Well, you've got gender stereotypes, right? You've got occupational segregation, where certain fields are seen as men's work and others as women's work. And then you've got unconscious bias creeping into hiring and promotion decisions.
It's like we can tell people to treat everyone equally, but that doesn't mean those deep-seated biases just magically disappear.
Exactly. And the report suggests that tackling this issue requires a much more comprehensive approach, one that combines legislation with broader social and cultural change.
So how do we do that? Where do we even begin?
It's about changing hearts and minds as much as it's about changing laws. We need to be promoting gender equality from a young age, challenging those harmful stereotypes we see in the media, encouraging more women to enter traditionally male-dominated fields.
Creating a more level playing field, not just in theory, but in practice.
Exactly. And this emphasis on a holistic approach, recognizing the interconnectedness of economic and social factors, is a recurring theme throughout the report.
It makes you wonder why we don't approach all policy decisions with this level of nuance and awareness.
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that leads us to another area where this interconnectedness is glaringly apparent in Maori development.
This report doesn't sugarcoat things, that's for sure. It really lays bare the disparities faced by Maori populations.
Yeah, it's a tough reality. And it's not just about present day inequalities either. It's about how those inequalities are directly connected to historical injustices.
Right, like the huge gap in land ownership. That didn't just happen overnight.
Exactly. The report really digs into the legacy of colonization, specifically land alienation, and how that continues to have a devastating impact on Maori communities today.
It's like this ripple effect across generations.
Yep.
And it's not just land, right? We're talking income, health, education.
Across the board. And the report uses this phrase, it really stuck with me, the high cost of being Maori.
Powerful, isn't it? It captures the weight of those systemic disadvantages.
It really does, and it challenges us to rethink our approach. It's not enough to just talk about equal opportunity when the starting line is so different.
So what needs to happen? How do we even begin to address this?
The report suggests a two-pronged approach, addressing past injustices while also dismantling those systemic barriers that continue to hold Maori back.
So righting the wrongs of the past and building a more equitable future? Easier said than done, I imagine.
For sure. But the first step is acknowledging that economic and social policy can't be separated from this historical context. We need solutions that are tailored to the specific needs and experiences of Maori.
This report has definitely broadened my perspective. It's a good reminder that to really understand these complex issues, we have to listen to all voices, all experiences.
Absolutely, and that includes voices from outside, too. Which brings us to another topic the report touches on, immigration.
Right, and how it's often seen as this threat.
Yeah.
But is that the whole story?
That's the thing, isn't it? We tend to view immigration through a very narrow lens. Competition for jobs, strain on resources.
Even a threat to cultural identity sometimes.
Right, all those fears. But what we often overlook is the incredible value that immigrants bring, both economically and socially.
They start businesses, contribute to the tax base, enrich our cultures.
Exactly. And this goes back to the report's call for a more integrated approach. We can't just look at immigration through a purely economic lens.
It's about people's lives. We need policies that are economically sound, but also just and compassionate.
Absolutely. And that brings us to, I think, our final big issue, those potential disincentives of unemployment benefits.
Ah, yes, the age-old debate. Do benefits discourage people from working?
It's a question that always seems to come up, and the report doesn't shy away from it. It acknowledges that, yeah, if benefits are high and wages are low, there's a risk of disincentivizing work.
But it's not that straightforward, is it?
Not at all. Context is key. For some people, especially those with families to support, those benefits are a lifeline.
And let's be honest, finding a job isn't always easy. It's not always about just wanting to work. There are so many factors at play.
Exactly. Access to transportation, childcare costs, discrimination in hiring. It's complicated, and simply cutting benefits doesn't address those deeper issues.
It's about finding that balance, right? Providing a safety net while also creating pathways for people to improve their situation.
Easier said than done, but that's the goal, and I think this report does a great job of highlighting those complexities.
It's been really eye-opening, this whole deep dive, I mean. It's made me question some assumptions, look at these issues in new ways.
That's what we want, to get people thinking critically, challenging those easy answers, because these are complex problems that require nuanced solutions.
Absolutely. Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks for taking the time to really dig into this report with me. Lots to think about.
My pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity, inspired you to learn more, and maybe even get involved in creating positive change in your own communities. Until next time.